Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay Sikora and I am a medical librarian at the Health Sciences Library at the University of Ottawa. I have been asked to create a video by some of my students that can be easily shared with others to describe what medical subject headings, MeSH, or subject headings are in a database in a way that kind of makes sense on why you would want to use them versus keywords, for example. So that's kind of what this short video is about. So the way I usually describe it to my students is the MeSH or the subject headings are used in a way, it's like the dictionary that is specific to the database, and you can use it as a dictionary or thesaurus depending on what the purpose is. So if you imagine that you have imagine the database is like a factory and you have two piles in the database. You have one pile that has MeSH, or an article is indexed by MeSH, and you have articles that don't have any MeSH attached to them, all right? And they're kind of like on a conveyor belt. So if you imagine that if you were to go into Google, for example, and you were to type in the word cancer, you would get articles and links and resources back on the word cancer. And that's great, but you might miss something because there are synonyms that are used for cancer, like carcinoma, or neoplasm, or tumor. So if it's the American spelling, it's without a U. If it's the British or Canadian spelling, it's with a U. So you have to kind of keep all of these little details in mind, which can be very overwhelming for someone, especially if they're new to doing a search strategy for a more comprehensive search, maybe for a systematic review or a scoping review or something of the like. So bearing that in mind, articles are kind of deposited into a database, whether it's weekly or monthly or whatever, it depends on the database, but they're deposited into the database without any MeSH attached to them, no indexing. They only have the keywords attributed by the author, but the author's keywords are different, sometimes they're different, than the words that are used or the MeSH that are used, the subject headings that are used when they're being indexed in a database. So this is why it's important, especially if you're doing a comprehensive search, that you want to search both. So what happens is that articles are deposited into the database with all of these different ways of describing them, like our cancer example, right? So if I wanted to retrieve all of these articles, I would need to make sure that I used each one of the different synonyms to describe cancer. The problem is what if you don't know what you don't know? So one of the ways that I've described this is that if you have the two piles of the database, articles are deposited here, and then what happens is if it moves down the conveyor belt, kind of in the middle of the two piles, you have a human being, almost like they have like their little dictionary of MeSH next to them, and they have this human being, and what they do is they are reading through the full text of the article, and then they are kind of slapping on the MeSH, kind of like a hashtag to each one of the articles. So if you have three articles in front of you, and each one talks about cancer, but they use different words to describe it. One uses cancer, one uses the word neoplasm, and one uses the word carcinoma. In the dictionary MeSH, the MeSH term for cancer is neoplasms. So it's like almost putting a hashtag and saying neoplasm, 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 and then they're moved further down the conveyor belt into the MeSH pile. So what's good about this is that now, regardless of what term is used to describe cancer, it's like you have one term to rule them all if you use the MeSH attributed to cancer. Now, obviously there are more nuances than this, right? There's different types of cancers, right? But you always want to kind of bear that in mind so that you always first want to search with a MeSH and use that MeSH, because within the MeSH, there's a scope note. So it'll give you the definition of what it means for that MeSH term, but it also gives you that list of synonyms. All right, now it's not an exhaustive list, but it definitely gets you thinking about what other terms you might want to consider. Because then once you have your MeSH and you develop your search strategy, then you know that you have to go to the other pile in your database and use that to discover what keywords you want to use. So that's kind of my crash course on when to use MeSH and how to use MeSH. I hope it was useful. Thank you for coming to my Linz Talk.